thanks for tuning into the Weekend Rewind. This is a great conversation I had with an absolute powerhouse of a woman, Zaretta Hammond. Actually, after this conversation, was it maybe a year or so after this was recorded? We actually met in New York. I was flying out later that afternoon. Zaretta happened to be in town, and so we had a really lovely coffee and breakfast in New York. And it's just really nice to meet people after you've had a great chat with them. And the good thing about podcasting is you don't really have surface level conversations. You actually go deep into finding out what someone does. And so what this conversation serves as is just a great platform for learning, and not only in the context of what Zaretta shares in the field of education, but everything she shares is applicable to how we learn at any level, whether it's individual or whether we're teaching others as well. I hope you enjoy this conversation and get as much value out of it as I did. Enjoy the chat, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Delighted, over the moon to bring today's guest and our conversation to you. She is a wonderful thought partner with the best time riffing on ideas. And what I admire about her is how she thinks and explains concepts using the power of metaphor. Her name is Zaretta Hammond, and she's the author of Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, promoting authentic engagement and rigour among culturally and linguistically diverse students. She refers to herself as a former writing teacher turned equity freedom fighter with a heart forever devoted to children and teachers. For the past 25 years, Zaretta has run a small independent education consulting practice, and she conducts research and writing while supporting schools in implementing instructionally focused equity work. Zaretta, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, I know a lot about your story and the incredible and impactful work that you do, but for listeners that have never heard about you, gosh, they should just hop onto Twitter and see like everything that you do on there. But can you give us a bit of a background on your story and how you discovered the work that you do today?
Yeah, I am in education. I'm an educator, and I consider myself a boots on the ground teacher, but honestly, I haven't had the run of my own classroom for a couple of decades now. My classroom is with teachers rather than with children. Teachers are my students, and so I consider myself a teacher educator. I'm also an author and have written a book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, because the work that I've always done has centered on how do we make sure that we can center equity in education so that we can really help historically marginalized students of African descent, Latinx students, and Indigenous students really thrive when schools weren't originally designed for them. And, they have to navigate sometimes hostile environments, but also what I call a cognitive red line. Schools have underdeveloped their capacity. So I really show teachers how to empower students using the science of learning and the science of reading and cognitive and social neuroscience to really help students become powerful learners where they feel they have the agency and the confidence to really soar and reach their highest potential.
Yeah. And I think when we've been talking, a lot of the stuff that you mentioned when you bring it into science, I think I was reflecting on the show going, oh, we talk about that on the show, but we've never really given it a label or known that it does have backing in neuroscience. Things like, raising levels of oxytocin and dopamine and things like that. And you've recently delivered a very large session, and we're just talking about how that went. And what I love about that is you were thinking about the experience, and something you spoke about was creating that sort of paint and sip vibe in your session. Can you please share with listeners, I guess, that's a really cool feeling to evoke with a group. And why do you think that was a nice experience for your participants to have?
Yeah, I have been kind of off the workshop circuit for a minute. My husband was ill and passed away recently, and that was over a year. And I realized it had been last May 2022 since I'd done a large group, and I had a similar size group, and we met 3 times over a 90-day period. And then, his illness became center stage, and I just really put that on pause. And so this was my first foray back into that kind of work. And while I really like working in smaller groups, kind of shoulder to shoulder with teachers building things, every now and then you're in the large kind of conference type workshop, leading people who may be familiar with your work or showing up because, a group of their teachers are coming. And that was the situation. So I wanted to use this as an opportunity to try a few new things and to really focus on the experience people were feeling. And, I've been doing this work, the facilitative part of leading large groups through things and teams through, experiences, particularly as they're trying to improve instruction for the better part of 25, 30 years. So I'm not new to that, but I am always looking at how do I elevate my facilitation game, because that is so critical, creating that container for people to do their best work, knowing it's going to be a little messy. And it should be. There's going to be productive struggle, and there should be. And I want people to have that. If I make it so that there's no struggling, and people are just passively listening or taking notes, the brain is really not going to remember that. So the whole notion of paint and sip comes from, the experience that some groups do, brides do it sometimes, or groups of people do it, and some people do it on a first date, like, oh, let's go to the shop and paint ceramics, and or make a painting, and then if it's grown folks only, you can get a glass of wine, and of course that's going to loosen you up, and everybody's laughing because nobody's a Picasso. And it just, no matter how the painting goes, there's an opportunity, because there's something in what they call the third space, you, me, and us doing something that allows you to actually start to talk and to let your guard down a little bit, and to be okay with productive struggle, but also to learn and connect with this person that you're with, or the group or the team that you're with. And that goes a long way when you have to do hard things together. Right. So you generate that and you build it up almost like a fuel. So when you do get to tough patches, we lean into that. So I really want it, because I call myself the provocateur. I tell people I'm not coming to be nice. I'm not going to be mean, but we're going to level up, right?
Wow.
And it's like the personal trainer is trying to get, 5 more reps out of you, and your legs already feel like jelly. So that was how I went into this. I really wanted to generate that feeling and to, experiment with different tools to do that.
Something that you're very like the queen of metaphors and really great sound bites, like the productive struggle. I've got a question around that is, as facilitators, I think we do want to create that moment of, where people are getting growth and leveling up. What's the difference between, like, how do we navigate productive struggle with struggle? What's the line there?
I usually will help people. The metaphor I use is the first pancake.
Yeah.
I lead with that. And I have a picture. There's a slide that I put up. I'm like, okay, we're going into the first pancake. And I just stop and like, you all know what the first pancake is. And everybody laughs because they do, right? And the first pancake is, coming off the griddle is beige and, gooey on one side. And that same pancake is crisp and burnt on the other side. And it is clear it needs some adjustment. And, the dog's going to get it, the baby, the garbage, somebody's going to get that pancake. But the reality is nobody shuts down the kitchen. The chef makes adjustments. Everybody's okay with those adjustments. And we know the good stuff's going to start coming off. And this is akin to design thinking, prototyping, iterating, right? Empathy, what's the user experience? So what I try to do is put a very practical spin on what we're going to do is going to stretch you. You may not have final answers. And, we start the day with, our community agreements, one of which is, expect and accept non-closure. Meaning you're going to get to a place where this still might feel unfinished, which can be unsatisfying for some people, right? I came to get well, you are getting something valuable. You may have a prototype that you're going to try out, and you're going to get some data back, and you're going to realize, oh, I need to tweak X, Y, and Z, but A, B, and C worked really nice. So I try to first get people in that space so that they know we are going to be in the learning pit. That term comes from James Nottingham's work, where he talks about the learning challenge and this idea that we grow through challenge and that productive struggle, and that is what we get in the pit. And I love neuroscience. That's like my thing. And
Yeah.
I weave it into everything. And what cognitive neuroscience tells us is that little stress and struggle is actually what builds your dendrites, what builds the thing that will eventually become gray matter. The more gray matter you have, the higher you can process information, the deeper your knowledge and what they call schema. So there's nothing but good things come from the actual activity of productive struggle, even if you don't come up with like, oh, here's the final right answer. It is the process that is the gold, where the gold is.
Yeah, I really like how you frame that up with the first pancake, particularly as like it kind of is it's disarming. Like if everyone laughs, we all get it. We all know that the first pancake is like, we know that things do get better. I really love that agreement that you spoke about, expect and accept non-closure. I've never heard anyone doing that, or I've never been in a session where someone's framed that, but it makes a lot of sense, because I've certainly been that, I've been in the room where I'm like, what's the output here? And we're also focused on the result and the output and finishing. And for you to frame it that way, I think it's a radical reframe for groups, because we live in a society where it's all about getting things done. How did you come to that agreement?
Well, I worked at the National Equity Project for 8 years. And prior to that, we were the Bay Area, the Coalition of Schools for Equitable Transformation. And part of what we did, it's actually where I, built my chops as a facilitator. And as we led groups through challenging territory, talking about diversity, talking about race, talking about, how they build their own leadership to help people navigate these issues, that was one of our set of a community agreements.
Yes.
So really helping people kind of stay present when the content gets a little, scary for some people, challenging, and we're not to talk about those things. And that part of our brain, the amygdala, wants to, have us kind of just check out, like stay present, process what you're doing, and so we had about 4 or 5 of them, and that was one of them. And I've continued to use that, because I do find, whether we're talking about instruction, I do a lot of around literacy, or whether we're talking about a culturally responsive teaching, it's the same. Because if we want people to stretch into their zone of proximal development, right, that's the scientific name for that learning pit, then we are going to have to help them understand what emotions they're going to navigate. And that one of those emotions is going to be, you're going to feel stretched. You're going to not feel where this is going. Like, and for adults, we really go there fast, right? Like, I don't really see the point of doing that. We come up with all our excuses when it really is all rooted in our emotions. So I try to use everything that's setting us up to create a container where we can do our best thinking, even if it gets a little messy.
Yeah. And the fact that, holding that space, you have been facilitating for quite some time. In the early days, when you were navigating these difficult, complex conversations with groups, how did that affect your presence? And I've got a sense sometimes of, if there's silence, like having to fill the silence, if there's awkwardness, it's like trying to just overcome the awkwardness. How did you deal with that, just holding the space and being present for your groups?
It's so funny, because when I started, honestly, I just sucked at facilitation. I was a really good teacher, working with small groups in like my department or whatever. I really could share the techniques and, talk with them. We could have these great conversations. But when it scaled up to facilitating a large group, then I didn't do as a good a job of that. I made it my business, right, to learn to be a better facilitator. Part of that journey, and I credit this to my colleagues at the organization I was with, is they really talk about this idea of who are you and how do you show up. So we leaned into John Heron's work, and that work is about the helping professional, right? How do you help? How will you have distress-free authority to hold the space so people actually can do the work that they need to do? Because people, particularly adults, can solve their own problems. The facilitator is not there to solve it for you. They're there to create a space in which you can do new thinking or creative thinking or dialogue with your colleagues to come up with new solutions. So being able to first just be okay with who I was and how I showed up, and to have my own process for managing my emotions. Because when you're talking about topics like diversity, or even talking about kids, and helping teachers kind of improve their practice, sometimes we blame kids and families. So, I be
Yeah.
standing up there like to stop, like, what are you talking about? And I have to, find my equilibrium so as not to project that or to bring that energy into the container. Now, that meant that we made sure before, during, and after, as a team of facilitators, we were making space for emotional processing. So we do use dyads to do that. We'd have one-on-ones, we'd have walk and talks during lunch. When people were doing that, we made sure we, as a facilitation team, got some emotional support and respite. And then we're able to go back in fresh. And so that was really powerful for me to realize that I almost like, someone preparing for a marathon
Yeah.
or Olympic event, I had to take care of myself. I watch what I eat beforehand, not too many carbs, not too much sugar, right? Because I need to stay alert. But I also know afterwards, all the glucose in my brain is gone. So, afterwards, then, there's going to be some French fries in my life.
It's funny. I've got my sort of after workshop. Like if I had a big day, there's like this Greek place down the road, and I know exactly what I'm going to order from them, just to take that sort of decision out of my
That's right.
brain.
That's right. You prepare that meal, or, if it's a cocktail or whatever, it could be a walk, it should involve some healthy options as well.
Yeah.
But the fact is, the bottom line and what we're talking about, and I think a lot of people don't think about, they think more about the strategies of facilitation, but to think of yourself as the orchestrator, and that you are the instrument. You are holding space quite literally. So people can be better and level up. Then we have to kind of, the way I think of it is, if I had kind of, in my arms, this large bowl in which all the people were in, at a certain point, my arms are going to get tired unless I've strengthened them and I'm hydrating. I have an opportunity to put it down and pick it up. That holding that space is a physical and emotional and spiritual task to do. So I've learned the hard way, having the very first facilitation experience where someone asked me a question, and I had my little spiel and I was doing it, and oh man, I couldn't get the people in the groups, count off, and it was just a hot mess. Someone asked me about the presentation and what is that axis? I couldn't tell them. And I had a mentor, and she was so gracious because it was clear it was just went sideways. And, it was break time. My, part of the facilitation of the day was done. And she said, let's go for a walk. And at no point did she just start laying into the critique. She just started asking me, how did you feel about that? What did you want them to feel and experience? And so just kind of backed into it. And like I said, over time, different parts of, my facilitation experience, worked on, leaned into, and braided it together, added new things, let go of some things that no longer served me as a facilitator. And so I think right now I had the definite thought afterwards, after being away from facilitating a very large group, because you're basically holding everybody. You can't just facilitate the people in front of you. There are people way over that, like, do you hear me? Am I going to get off the stage and walk over there as people are doing? How am I engaging? And I came, at the end of the day, I realized I wasn't as tired as my self, 20 some odd years ago.
Oh,
That day would have just like, I'd have been ready to sit in a chair and just like, oh, just go out. Right. And I still had energy. And I thought, oh, wow, look at that. And
yeah.
even away after a year, I still felt like I had energy. But all that prep, all the experience, there's muscle memory there, and some new tricks after talking and with you as a thought partner. Always can add new tricks. So yeah, I felt like letting people have an experience that they feel as a sensation in their body, not just in their head, is
Mm.
key to people feeling like this was a good day.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really very reassuring to hear that after that session, you weren't feeling exhausted. So maybe I've just got to do another few years and I'll get I'll get to get that time on my feet. I think there's also, I mean, something you alluded to there was like the value of having co-facilitators, being able to take that walk and talk and, talk to each other. And as solopreneurs or people that facilitate independently, often we're just stuck in our own minds. After a session, we might have that negative bias towards something that happened and we can't get that out of our minds. So there is value in having a network of people that you can bounce and talk to. Preparation. I tend to find there's a couple of different facilitator camps, people that like to just, oh, I know the content, I'll just pull the workshop the day before and we'll move on to it. And then there's other people that like to prepare a bit more and a bit more thorough. Where do you sit on that continuum? And what does your process look like leading up to a big day like that?
I'm a little bit of both, but mine is much more, I do believe preparing a day of learning for adults is a creative thing.
Yeah.
So I prepare very much like a sculptor might, like I got this block of clay, or I got this piece of wood, or I got this stone, and they walk around it, look at it, they imagine. So usually, like a lot of people will book with me, I'm full right now through September, and that I closed my book at the end of February, beginning of March. So a lot of these have a few months, lead time. I would say 2 months, because I have so many. 2 months, I put it on my radar. So what that means is I have creative time in the morning. When it is still dark, I get out. I find that is my most creative time. And I allow myself the time to think about that. So I've had a pre-engagement conversation. What would the client like to see be true? Right. And if they're like in some kind of unreasonable land, that's my opportunity to kind of like bring them back to reality. This is what we can accomplish. But I want to listen to them in terms of what the theme of it is. What is it that they've done before that we're building on? What are the misconceptions? Have they gone down a wrong road and you are trying to bring them back? How can I help you do the thing you want to do? And people are like, they just want to hear you talk. No, they don't. You want them to do something that I can help by this information and experience I can give them. So we have that talk. I let it incubate so that in that dark time, and I've assigned they can have that morning, and this is 8 weeks out. And then I start to think about a metaphor. What's the story? What's going to anchor it? Then I can build it around that, with the purpose of moving people from this place they are at, the client told me about, to this new place that I think is going to allow them to get onto the next leg of their journey. And then so I scribbled that down, a little notebook for it. I might, if I'm inspired, open up a PowerPoint or Google slide deck and just write a couple of things, and then I leave it there. And then what I've basically done is till the ground, planted some seeds, and I let my subconscious, unconscious mind start to do the creative work. So now then I just go on about my business, working on my next book, or, whatever I'm doing working with a team or whatever. And then I will, maybe in another week or whenever something pops in, I'll scribble it down. And then as I get closer, maybe 2 weeks out, I'll populate that slide deck a little more. But it's now, getting that 2 week to 1 week. Now we're in the full creative mode. What images do I want on these slides? What saying what quotes am I going to pull down? And the other thing I do is in that 2 week period is start to create what I call a facilitated agenda. And I learned this working with facilitation teams. It is so detailed that it is part script, it is part stage direction. How much time are we going to give this? What's the in between? Where are the people at? What might be some of the pitfalls here? What should we plan for in facilitation? Like one of the icebreakers we like to do when I was working with the National Equity Project, and I still use it, is diversity rounds. And diversity rounds ask people to self-organize along some identity markers. So it could be organize yourself around race, what your racial identity is. So now everybody's looking around at each other. Like obviously you might see some Black people or indigenous folk or Asian folk. And then, there might be 3 groups of white people. And folks are looking at them like, why are there 3 groups? Because you're not supposed to make your own separate group. And there might be people who are Jewish. Like we do not identify as white people. It's like, it is such an interest, and talk amongst yourselves about the variety of that. So creating the container and being prepared for kind of the awkwardness, because we are so unpracticed globally in terms of talking about things like race. But I can imagine if you were talking about certain parts of gender, or you are talking about other subjects that might be not the regular topics, helping people kind of do that. But it also is part of what I call that selective vulnerability, where people like, we are going to get practiced at talking about these things or saying the words out loud. So that's what I typically do when I start to do that facilitated agenda. And then again, how is that going to be reflected in the PowerPoint? So by that time, and I will tell you, a lot of people like, send us the slides 2 weeks early. I'm like, nope, you're not going to get them. I am like a DJ. I am still tweaking those slides, I'd say the 2 days before. I try not to do it the night before, the morning before.
Guilty.
I'm there, like, I'm gonna tweak that, and but it's like that. It's like, it's a creative thing.
I agree. Yeah. I think
it's packaged, and I'm gonna send it to you because I'm like, whatever that deck is just not gonna be the same one I've got. 2 more things, right?
Thank you for, again, you're so good at the metaphor and talking about just a piece of clay, and it is a real creative endeavor. And people ask me my design process. I've never been able to articulate it like you just did, because I definitely do some priming, like, what's the experience? And then I will let it just sit in the subconscious and trust that things will emerge when I need them to emerge. But it's not like, between 9 and 10 a.m. today, I'm just going to create this thing, because then I'm just... it doesn't work. Unfortunately, I wish it would work that way, but it doesn't. Yeah, it is conversations. You pull things out, you observe new things because you've just primed it that way. So I love that you phrased it.
What I would say, Leanne, is you do have to invite the muse in. So there's a point at which I will schedule that. I'm going to work on that, and at between 9 and 10. And I'm just going to sit there, and maybe it's just doing the tweaking the slides, what's the end slide, and that lunch slide needs to go in there, and the break time, where's my break time slide, what can I cannibalize from another? It is mundane to the point where the muse knows, you sitting, you ready for that? I got some stuff for you. Right? So it's almost training yourself to say, I'm ready for that other creative part. But then there's the technical part of setting that deck up. So it is this interesting piece that I think the more you get into facilitation, the technical gives way to the creative. Certainly starts when you're a new facilitator. You got to get the technical parts. You got to know how to end your segment, right? One of the things people comment to me all the time is, wow, your timing, you never run over, you always, and I'm always in the moment. There is something I'm going to drop because I could see if we continue, we're going to run over
Mm.
versus like it's on the agenda. So I got to do everything. And at the very beginning, the technical part of that, you have to pay attention so that
Yeah.
you can give space to all of the goodness that's in the agenda, which is the creative pieces that you put in there. But your brain is always running. I'm always scanning the room. I'm looking at the agenda. I'm looking at the clock. I'm actually trying to make enough space. I leave enough space for spontaneity, for people to have a reaction or to have an emotion that doesn't feel like it takes us so far off the agenda now, because people don't realize we need that. But that sponge time, even if people don't need as much, there are things we can do with it.
Mm.
So I think that's the marriage of the technical and the creative. And, we start to have structures and processes in which we do that.
Yeah, that phrase, inviting the muse in and having to actually just physically sit down and to land these topics. It's, yeah, a really great analogy. How do you, before we sort of close off, how do you come up with these metaphors and analogies? It just seems so natural for you. Is this the way that you talk? Is this just a Zaretta thing? Or have you learned to be better at this?
That is the way my brain works. And here's what I tell folks, when I'm training facilitators, I just trained 5 facilitators to start to kind of coach my framework starting last summer. And what I tell them is they have to find their flavor. You got to find the thing that you do that is like it, you don't have to think about it. For me, I'm what they call a symphonic thinker. I start to put things together that don't seem like they go together. That's what metaphors are made of, right?
Yeah.
How is this thing like that thing? Well, if you're a symphonic thinker, Dan Pink talks about this a lot. And in A Whole New Mind, in one of his many books, that was an early one, wonderful book, you should get it.
Yeah, well.
And he talks about this idea of, people who can see the implied relationships between things that don't seem on the surface to have a relationship. And for whatever reason, my brain sees those chords and connections, and therefore I do them. And I love pop culture. So what I find is, in order to really get a group moving together, you have to tap the collective schema. What does this whole group know enough about together that everybody would shake their head in unison? Human experience, maybe it's movies, maybe it's an age group, right? So as a facilitator, you have to know enough about all of, or a little bit of all of those things, right? And for me, that's movies. I like pop culture, and that's my thing. And I encourage my facilitators, find your thing. And not going to look like mine. Don't be trying to be like, pulling metaphors out of the air, because it's going to look awkward. But the more you're comfortable in your own skin, the more you're okay with whatever your flavor is, but you have to figure that out. And then how do you leverage that in your facilitation?
Yeah, I think that's terrific advice for first-time facilitators, because I think when I started facilitating, I'd wanted to be like my favorite facilitators. And then I realized that it just didn't feel right, didn't sit right in my body. And I felt, yeah, so that's probably the move, is to find your flavor. Zaretta, you've just got just incredible wisdom. I think a lot of the work that you do can be just so helpful for our facilitators that are leading conversations. Where can people go if they want to connect with you, find your book, learn more about what you do?
Yeah, they can go. My website is crtandthebrain.com. It's not much there, it needs to be revamped, but you can see what is there. They can check out the book, Culturally Responsive Teaching of the Brain. And they can find me on Twitter. I'm always on there trying to respond to somebody. It's a great medium for kind of instant connection. Instagram, not so much, but I do check my account. I do a lot of podcasts, and so they can just Google me, and I'm trying to have a conversation with a whole lot of different people. But I will say I love facilitation. Given that I started terrified and just not very good at it, I've made myself a student and have continued. And I would love at some point to be able to offer a little bit of what you do, for people who are in an area that I am. So they can always just connect with me and, reach out to me with a question about facilitation. And it won't seem like, well, I know you're in education. Like, no, this is what we do together. We're trying to help people level up no matter what the industry. We are a village, a community.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. We'll put a link to everything in the show notes for this one. And just keep showing up and doing what you do. Bring your amazing energy, your way of thinking. It's making an impact. And I know this conversation will as well. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show.